Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. Our guest in this episode is Amory Lovins, a distinguished environmental scientist and co-founder of RMI, which he co-founded in 1982 as Rocky Mountain Institute. It's what he calls a think, do and scale tank, with 700 people in 62 countries and a budget of well over $100 million a year. For over 5 decades, Amory has championed innovative approaches to energy systems, advocating for a world where energy services are delivered with least cost and least impact. He's advised all manner of governments, companies and NGOs and published 31 books and over 900 papers. It's an overused word, but in this case it's justified. Amory is a true thought leader in the global energy transition. Amory, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Amory.
Likewise.
Amory, back in 1976, you published an article in Foreign Affairs called Energy Strategy, The Road Not Taken, in which you described 2 paths the US could take in energy. The hard path was continued reliance on centralized energy production using fossil fuels and nuclear fission. The soft path was switching to efficient use and decentralized renewable sources. I think it's fair to say that for many years the US and the rest of the world took the hard path, but that in recent years there's been more progress than most people recognize towards the soft path. How do you think it's going?
Actually, quite well. Much better than most people realize. The U.S. has cut its energy use per dollar of GDP by about 2/3 so far, with a lot more to go. We're just scratched the surface of how much efficiency is available and worth buying. Likewise, in much of the world, over 90% of the new electric capacity being installed worldwide is now renewable. That is, of the additions, not the existing stock. And that means that fossil generation will continue to be squeezed out, running fewer hours each year until the plants go bust and have to be shut down. Just this year, the world is expected to install nearly 600 billion watts of new solar capacity alone, not counting wind and other renewables. This is an extraordinary achievement. In fact, the capacity to make solar cells just in China is about twice that, which means we're locked in for the rest of the decade to rock bottom prices as the overbuilt module makers struggle for any profits. That will open up many new markets. And in fact, solar modules are now so cheap that I was just told in Sweden they're the cheapest thing to sheath your house in or build your garden fence out of. So they make sense even if they produce no electricity.
Wow. Why do you think most people are not aware of this?
It's not much reported, especially the efficiency side. Efficient use of energy is half the historic decarbonization in the world and at least half of future decarbonization, and yet it gets perhaps 1% of the attention. Nearly all the attention goes to the shiny objects, the renewables that you can actually see on the rooftops and the skyline, whereas energy is invisible and the energy you don't use is almost unimaginable. So it's much harder to see, harder to report on, and it tends to get little or no attention.
But given that many people, in fact, I'm sure a great majority of people around the world think that climate change is an important issue, why are journalists and the public at large just not getting this message that we are making such good progress? It may not be fast enough, but it is good progress.
Some do report that, but good news doesn't attract as much attention and revenue.
So it's just a case of if it bleeds, it leads.
Let me serve up some bad news for you to respond to. The bad news that China seems to be continuing to install new coal-powered plants, which would be contrary to the trend that you described in the beginning.
Those plants are kind of insurance in case of hydro drought and other disruptions, but they're unlikely to run. The operating hours of Chinese coal plants have been declining by about 2.5% a year, with brief interruptions when for extraneous reasons, the government decided to fire up lots more steel and cement production or other energy-intensive activities for a few quarters to boost jobs and GDP during an economic lull. But it's clear that the renewables are cheaper to build and run than just running existing coal plants, and they're about half the cost of a new nuclear production. So those are a small part of the energy investment China's making. Most of that is in renewables, and the next biggest part in efficiency. So, yes, in a country as big as China, you would expect some things to be built that are not wholly consonant with the strategy. But this is actually mostly because some municipal mayor or provincial governor is trying to meet a GDP growth target, and the way they know how to do that is to build a coal plant and perhaps something like an aluminium smelter for it to operate. But there's only so much of that you can do because it's limited by demand.
So let's go back to the question of whether the improvement is fast enough. As you pointed out, it's considerably more than people often imagine. But is the transition to renewables and away from dirty energy going to be sufficient to avoid climate catastrophe in the foreseeable future?
We're already behind time and have a lot of acceleration to do. The point is, we have the technologies and the economics to avoid the worst effects of climate change. We're accelerating towards doing so. We need to accelerate faster. We need to roughly double the pace. The capacity to do so is there. The political understanding and will may not be. So we all have a lot of work to do. Fortunately, the deployment is not only the province of national governments, let alone international agreements. It can be done by anybody. Whenever you make a purchase or a use decision, you can decide to go efficient and clean. And that's fractal. It extends throughout the economy at every scale.
You mentioned nuclear, and you've long been a stern critic of nuclear fission, pointing out that nuclear plants are neither economically competitive nor reliable. You've observed that nuclear power is the only energy source where mishap or malice can kill many people far away, the only one whose ingredients can help make and hide nuclear bombs. Are you still negatively disposed towards nuclear?
Well, I used to think it was a good idea before I learned more about it, but I think the evidence is overwhelming that it's a bad idea, and it actually makes climate change worse for a very simple reason. It's dearer and slower than efficiency and renewables. Therefore, it produces less electricity per pound or per year than investing in its cheaper carbon free competitors would do. Therefore, it makes climate change worse than if you didn't do it and bought the cheaper things first.
Some of the people I talk to will give two reasons why nuclear is still comparatively expensive. They'll say that it hasn't got the scale, it's been cut back. Many of the innovations that could be possible to reduce the costs have not been progressed. And secondly, they'll say that the burden of regulation is excessive and that there's certainly good reason for regulations, but the regulations are somehow tied into what made sense in the 1970s rather than what would be appropriate to design of new nuclear systems in the 2020s. Do you have any sympathy for these points?
Not much. I don't think the evidence really supports them. But let's make this much simpler. If the nuclear parts of a nuclear power plant cost nothing, and you were just left with what's called the balance of plant, that is the steam turbine, the generator, the switchyard, and so on, those are on the order of 78 to 87% of the prohibitive capital cost, and they would still be uncompetitive with new renewables or efficiency by several fold, probably about six-fold in the United States, for example. So again, even if the nuclear part were free, it would still be many-fold uncompetitive and less climate effective than buying efficiency or renewables instead.
A lot of the people who advocate nuclear would say that it is the least damaging from a carbon perspective way of creating base capacity, because obviously renewables generally are only effective some of the time. Solar doesn't work at night and when there's too much cloud. Wind doesn't work when it's not windy. And nuclear gives us that base capacity. You have no sympathy with that view?
None, because this notion of baseload is a kind of antique honorific applied to the way we used to run the grid with big thermal plants, that is, steam raising plants, fossil or nuclear, running whenever they could do, then intermediate load factor plants and rarely run, dear to run peaking plants. That's not the way we run a modern grid anymore. And the reason is that grids are supposed to run on a principle called economic dispatch, as most countries do, although Japan does the opposite, to protect their legacy thermal plants from competition. Economic dispatch simply means that you run the stations that cost the least to operate. That has no regard to what you paid to build them, because that's what's called sunk cost. You already paid it, and you can only make decisions about the future, not the past. But the plants that cost the least to run are the renewables, the old hydro, the new solar and wind, and so on. Therefore, you run them whenever they're available, and then everything else follows the remaining net load. Now, it turns out that big thermal stations are very bad for following that load. That's not what they were designed to do. It makes them even more uneconomic because you're spreading their fixed cost over fewer units of electricity sent out. It's a lot of stress on them to cycle them up and down because you have these huge masses of metal being heated and cooled, and they start cracking and corroding more and so on. And this is true of nuclear plants as well, which are even worse at load following. You can do a bit of it, but at a considerable economic penalty. When you cycle the thermal power plants, they don't last as long, they cost more in maintenance, they get less efficient. Therefore, you have more incentive to phase them out faster and put in quicker a diverse portfolio of renewables, diversified by both type and location, so they don't all see the same weather at the same time and they're not in the same place. It turns out, for example, that this is valuable even on a seasonal level, because wind and solar tend to peak at different times of the year, solar in the summer and wind in the winter. And they also have a lot of complementarity during each day. But bear in mind that there are actually 10 ways to match up varying solar and wind output with the needs of electricity for services at the times we want them. Storage is one of those. It happens to be the dearest one, and it works fine. Behind the meter storage in your house actually has 13 kinds of economic benefits, so it's a pretty good deal. But there are another 9 methods that are even cheaper. Some of those are on the demand side, some on the supply side. The 2 most important are efficient and timely use of electricity, and those are each about 3 times as big a resource as had been thought. That is what we call integrative design, designing buildings, factories, and vehicles as whole systems, not as piles of isolated little parts, can save several times more energy than had been thought. So let me get back to your initial question about how efficient use is going. We tend to think of efficiency as a binary resource. Do you have it or not? Like, does your house have a garage or not? But it's not like that. It's a spectrum, and it's a very dynamic resource because, like renewables, it's evolving quickly. The biggest evolution in efficiency now is not just technology, but also design. Just to give you the magnitude, if you switch from thermal stations to solar and wind, you save the roughly 2/3 losses in the power plants. If you switch your vehicles to electric propulsion, you save the big losses in the internal combustion engines. And those and other savings in the upstream energy conversions from natural energy flows or fuels in the ground to final energy delivered for use, that saves about 2/3 of the primary energy use in the world. But there's another kind of energy efficiency that's even larger, and that's in converting final energy delivered for use to the actual services you get from it, like hot showers and cold beer and mobility and baked breads and spelted alumina, comfort. Well, that end use efficiency, we're used to thinking can be about doubled again. We've doubled or trebled it so far. But actually, the potential is much larger if you do integrative design. You can improve end use efficiency by about a factor of 5. And at a historically reasonable pace, that would take till about 2060, although you could get about a factor 3 by 2040. That then multiplies by the roughly threefold savings upstream. Now, if I were to start this conversation by saying we have a potential energy savings of a factor on the order of 15, nobody would believe it. But if you break it down into those two bits, then it starts to sound more plausible. And it is indeed what experience says. I teach integrative design at Stanford. It takes about 800 slides to go through all the examples of how integrative design works in industry, mobility, and buildings in different settings around the world, big and small, old and new. But the empirical examples we've developed over decades from our practice and that of others are very convincing, and the economics are terrific.
Can you give us some examples of the big hitters, the big components of that factor of 5 increase in energy efficient at the end user?
Yes, let me give you an example of integrative design from each sector. I live in a passive solar banana farm high in the Rocky Mountains where temperatures used to go to minus 44 Celsius. But my house has no heating system, and in the middle of the house, we're ripening our 83rd passive solar banana crop. But the house was cheaper to build that way because I saved more construction costs leaving out the heating system than I paid extra for the super windows, super insulation, ventilation, heat recovery, and so on that eliminated the heating system. In other words, by optimizing the house as a system, not the insulation as a component, I made the whole thing cheaper to build, saving 99% of the space heating energy, but I also, for a little extra, saved 99% of the water heating energy, 90% of the household electricity, for which the initial bill was $5 a month before we went solar for 372 square meters, and also half the water, and all the savings paid back in 10 months with 1983 technology. Today's is much better and cheaper. Out in the driveway is parked a German electric car, BMW i3, made of carbon fiber, which we were told was ridiculously expensive. But actually, that ultralight, ultra-strong material is paid for by much simpler manufacturing and by eliminating a lot of batteries to carry 300 extra kilograms around. Most of the energy it takes to move your car is caused by its weight. So it turns out that making the car very lightweight and therefore quadrupling its efficiency and all, from both lightweighting and electrification, didn't cost extra. Because again, the car is optimized as a system rather than the structural material as a component. Or a third example, half the world's electricity is used to run motors. Half the motor power runs pumps and fans. Now, the pumps and fans move things like air and water through pipes and ducts. But if you make the pipes and ducts fat, short, and straight, instead of thin, long, and crooked, the friction in the pipes and ducts go down by 80 to 90 odd percent. 97% in my house. That means that the pumps and motors and inverters and electrical supplies become 80 to 90 odd percent smaller and therefore cheaper. A fatter pipe itself costs more. The cost goes up as about the square of the diameter, but the friction goes down as nearly the fifth power of diameter. So if we optimize the pipe as a component, we're pessimizing the system. But if we optimize the whole thing, the fat, short, straight pipes and ducts, if everybody did them, would save a fifth of the world's electricity at negative cost, or say half the coal-fired electricity. And you typically get your money back, we find empirically, in less than a year in retrofits and instantly in new builds. So why isn't this in any government study, industry forecast, standard engineering textbook, or climate model? Well, because it's not a technology. It's a design method. And not many people yet think of design as a scaling vector, a way to achieve speed and scale in decarbonization.
Now, what you've described isn't just an improvement on the environment, it should be an economic boon because there's lots of money that can be saved. So surely there must be smart entrepreneurs who want to make money who will say, I'm going to apply this thing. It's not a technology, but it's integrated design. I'm going to apply that and make lots of money. And by the way, help the environment too. So why aren't they at least picking this up?
Oh, some are, and of course, some of them are our graduates from that Stanford course. But there are very, very few places that teach this sort of thing. And again, it's not in the standard textbooks. So we have a lot of catching up to do in testing and those 20 or so scaling vectors and pushing on the ones that work. There may be a hidden advantage here because you don't need to go back to school and learn any new theory to make, say, your pipes and ducts fat, short, and straight. Any plumber or pipe fitter or sheet metal worker that sees a picture of it will say, oh, I could do that. I could be a hero. And in fact, I'm finishing in these weeks a publication to go initially to the chief engineers of the 17,000 biggest factories in China, and then around India and in the English-speaking world and so on. The Chinese edition, Guangdao Jidao, it's called The Tao of Pipes. In about 90 pages with attractive illustrations, it shows how you can untangle your pipe noodles. And I think if a small number of those chief engineers realize the advantages of doing that, competition will spread it very quickly.
It sounds great. It also sounds quite expensive to retrofit the existing housing stocks around the world with these more efficient approaches. Is there a quick and easy way to do it? Or is it necessarily a gradual process and mostly a new build?
It is necessarily gradual, but it doesn't have to be terribly expensive. For example, many buildings, especially in our older cities or those in Europe rebuilt after the war, are masonry buildings, and those can be often retrofitted with a Dutch technique called energiesprong, energy leapfrog, where instead of very labor intensive and skill intensive internal retrofitting of super insulation inside the house or in the structure of the house, you put super outsulation around the house, prefabricated, factory built insulated panels, or perhaps even spray on insulation. That is like putting a tea cozy around your house and can rather quickly, even in as little as a day, convert it to net zero energy by adding some solar panels on the roof. That technique is now being applied in 5 European countries, spreading rather quickly.
You've been watching this whole field for 5 decades, 50 years. What are your thoughts about what's most likely to happen in the next 10 years or so? Are we going to have more of the same? Are people going to pick up the importance of design? Are political factors going to interfere positively or negatively in the trajectories we're on?
All of the above. That is, it will go faster. I think we will end up at least doubling the pace of efficiency and trebling that of renewables. The renewables part is already baked in. The efficiency part takes some more work and especially some more realization of the size of the prize. Politics will probably interfere. Some other politics will help. We are seeing the expected rearguard actions from fuel mongers trying to convince us that this isn't practical, it's too dear, it's too difficult, just keep on buying our stuff. But I think they are getting properly worried that their losing share. Probably this year or next year is the year of peak CO2 production in China. And in the world, it's also very, very close. In the industrialized countries, it's already passed. The oil companies, in particular, are quite properly getting worried that they're in a sunset industry. They're not going to go on growing their sales because their product is simply uncompetitive with efficiency and renewables. That's already happened to the coal industry, which lost three-fourths of its world share value, or 99% in the US. And I used to think that it would happen for natural gas, methane gas would be a more accurate term, later than for oil, but I now think they'll probably decline pretty much in phase with each other because every gas market is under severe competitive threat. What's really driving this is fundamental economics, policies playing catch up.
Well, talking about policy, you've traditionally been careful to be apolitical, but there's no avoiding the fact that a second Trump term, controlling all the branches of government and without the so-called adults in the room, may well have serious impacts on the energy transition. Are you willing to venture any thoughts about that?
Well, we've seen this movie before, and it's always disruptive, but I think the disruptions to our polity and economy will be less severe for energy than for many other sectors because there's this fundamental economic driver at play, and also because in the United States we have rather a weak federal policy apparatus and framework. Most of our big energy decisions are actually made at a state or local level. About half the states will not just continue but intensify their efficiency and renewables efforts, and many of the others will as well. Something like 80% of the funding coming out of our Inflation Reduction Act under the current administration has actually gone to Republican-led states. That's partly because there's this big wind belt down the middle of the country from Texas to the Canadian border. But also, Texas, for example, a deeply Republican state, is by far the national leader, not just in wind, but also increasingly in solar power, and will any year now surpass California in that regard, because Texans are very good at building things and at making money. They're not doing it because it's green, they're doing it for profit and also for resilience. They've had serious grid interruptions from both hot and cold weather and want to get out of that position, and are doing so rather rapidly. So we're in for interesting times, but the fundamentals favor continuing the transition no matter how much the White House would rather have a different outcome. We have had, of course, one Trump administration previously, and we've had a number of other conservative administrations that would try to shut down renewable research and deployment, but it kept going merrily along and in many cases accelerated just because the economic and security and environmental and health benefits are so strong, they're irresistible. The last time, I think it might have been even under President Reagan, that they tried to shut down the Renewable Research National Lab. Many of its staff simply migrated into the private sector and state governments and brought their expertise there, and it was a great infusion of new skills in energy that sped things up.
Can I ask you about energy security as well? Because one takeaway from our experience with COVID is that many of the global supply chains turned out to be more fragile and vulnerable than we'd previously thought. Does your analysis of energy have any implications for how countries can avoid having their energy supplies disrupted by geopolitical or other changes?
Oh, very much so. The most obvious thing is that if you do efficiency renewables, you're no longer dependent on fossil fuels. To be sure, you may be dependent in the short run on renewable technologies, about three-fourths of whose supply chains are based in China, but that's rather rapidly diversifying. That is, I think, a short-term dependence, and it doesn't mean you can't get the stuff. It just means that you're importing it as we import fuels today. but there's more certainty of getting it. China certainly wants to keep exporting its solar panels and wind turbines. And the growth in alternative exporters, including India, that will scale to be quite large, is impressive. But there are other kinds of energy security concern than just import dependence. There's also the fundamental resilience of the supply. If your solar power is coming from your own roof, there's a lot less to go wrong getting it to you than if it's coming hundreds of kilometers through a fragile grid, which is where most power failures originate. Your solar cells do depend on weather, but again, that can be diversified, and there are 10 ways to even out on all timescales the fluctuations in the solar and wind output. Whereas conventional power plants, including nuclear ones, are quite vulnerable to weather. You can have frozen up coal plants, frozen canals so the barges can't move, high temperatures that make power stations get inefficient or even shut down, restrict their output. Renewables are generally less vulnerable to climate change, including sea level rise affecting coastal installations that were put there for cooling water. And then, of course, there are the cyber vulnerabilities of the grid, and those can be well resisted by local renewable supply. And all of these interruptions become less important with efficient use, which not only makes the needed supply smaller and cheaper and faster, it also makes things fail slower. The temperature of your building, for example, will change much more slowly if it's better insulated. And that gives you more time to fix what's broken or to improvise new supplies.
If some of our listeners are encouraged and inspired by what they've heard today, which one of your 31 books should they pick up and start reading first?
Reinventing Fire. It's from 2011, but it's surprisingly fresh.
What's the basic premise of Reinventing Fire?
Reinventing Fire synthesizes, in the context of the United States, but in a world setting and with many references to other countries' experience, what happens if you combine modern efficiency with modern renewables in a well-designed grid. I think you'll find it quite surprising. Nowadays, I would say it's very conservative because although we did expect renewables would get a lot cheaper, they got even cheaper, even faster than we'd said. So we were a bit more conservative than we intended, but that just strengthens the conclusions.
Now, are you sending a copy to the new Secretary for Energy in the Trump administration?
We'll see if that's worthwhile. But there are many, many copies on desks already around the world, and particularly in the Pentagon, where it was very popular, because, of course, they see the current energy system as a major threat multiplier and efficiency and renewables as major sources of better security. And indeed, they are, within the US government, the national leader in deploying those technologies in their own operations so that they can have neg missions in the Persian Gulf, mission unnecessary. And they really like that idea.
Well, Amory, I think your view of the energy transition is more optimistic than most people's, and I find that very refreshing, especially these days. So thank you very much indeed for joining us on the London Futurists podcast.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks.